VIENNA Calling, der Videopodcast von und mit Petra Bayr. Aktuelle Fragen der Zeit kurz und prägnant beantwortet.
Welcome to a new edition of VIENNA Calling. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Liping Mian today. We met the first time in 2008 when we were preparing the International AIDS Conference in Vienna, where Liping was the youth representative. Meanwhile, she studied, and meanwhile, she's a human rights activist. Liping studied human rights and humanitarian action in Paris. And after her studies, she was active at the private sector for a decade and observed how business tries to align human rights with their activities. So thank you very much for joining us from Singapore, where it's the afternoon at the moment. To start with, you coming from the practice, from the private business, what is your impression about the level of implementation of the guiding principles and business and human rights? How does it go?
Thank you so much, Petra, for having me. So I would say that business and human rights have gained significant recognition globally since UN Human Rights Council endorsed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in January 2011. So when I was studying in Paris from 2012 to 2014 in human rights and humanitarian actions, at that time, many companies' sustainability team are usually small, and it was very rare to have dedicated professional just for human rights topics. But much has changed in the past decades. So now it is very common that for companies to actually integrate sustainability into their business strategy and operations. And also it is noticeable that there's a much increase of the numbers of professionals working in sustainability, but also dedicated in human rights as well. So on top of that, another observations I have had is that over the decades, I can tell that it's very common for companies to include human rights topics in their sustainability reporting, such as the labor rights for their employees, but also across their value chains, based on some internationally recognized sustainability reporting standards and frameworks. So all of those evolution demonstrate that there's an increasingly level of commitment in human rights within the corporate world.
Mm-hmm. When we talk, and also what you mentioned, when we talk about all that which is now on the table, it's guiding principles or it's guidelines, it's all voluntary, it's not binding. Yeah. What challenges do you think remain in this field?
Indeed. So often, I think those international standards and frameworks are voluntary basis. So it's in terms of the implementation level, there are still some gaps. For the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, it's recognized the primary role of states to protect human rights and also to ensure remedy in case of violations within their jurisdiction. And government can actually do that by developing and implementing policies and regulations, both mandatory and voluntary, to require or encourage business to fulfill their human rights responsibilities. But in reality, how much to extent the government actually fulfill their duties, often depending on their knowledge about human rights topics, as well as their commitment relative to other priorities, such as economic growth. So taking the mining industry, for example, improper management of waste can lead to water and food contaminations, which infringe the human rights of nearby communities. But often the regulations or policies requiring business to fulfill those human rights responsibilities really differ from country to country. So when the government doesn't impose the obligations to business, it's often provide business opportunities to deprioritize human rights topics, because normally human rights issues take time to manifest, and often it become apparent when the nearby communities, the population start having health problems. But even after that, they start having health problems. It still required substantial effort and time to prove there is a correlation between industrial practice and human rights violations. So all of those kind of the challenges we still need to tackle in order to better defend business and human rights.
So it's still the job of governments of countries to make laws that hold also enterprises accountable for their obligation.
I would say that government has a very important role, but it's not only government, because the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights also require the business to respect internationally recognized human rights, regardless of the local legislations. But in reality, how much company does that depending many issues, regulations and policies is from the government is one side, but sometimes it's also coming from end customers, from investors, and from other stakeholders in the economic system. So not only that, but it's part of the challenges I would say we need to tackle.
Mm-hmm. We will come back to the stakeholders and their role a little bit later, I suggest. Meanwhile, there is the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which entered into force in January 23. Maybe you can explain a little bit what this directive is, how it applies also to enterprises outside the European Union, and what chances you see in this directive.
Sure. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directives, we also call it CSRD. It's actually, for me, is a very significant step forward to address some of the challenges I mentioned earlier. Because first of all, it's actually made the sustainability reporting mandatory for companies. So all of the companies impacted by CSRD need to do mandatory reporting, and also they need to make sure their reporting is transparent, accessible, and comparable, which actually enhance accountability. And also companies are requested to disclose long-term sustainability impact in their reports. And that actually include the future human rights implications as well. So that also kind of address part of the challenges. Secondly, I think CSRD has a very much wider scope than the previous directives. It's directly impacted over 50,000 companies. But not only that, because those impacted companies, they also need to disclose information across their value chain. And often their value chain are global. So that means that CSRD also have an indirectly global outreach, even though it is a EU policy. And thirdly, CSRD also highlighted the importance of third-party assurance. And that actually ensure the credibility of the sustainability reporting. Once the quality of the reporting improves, it can better guide the decision-making of the company's management, as well as their stakeholders like investors, civil societies, communities, and end customers. So all of those, I would say that are improvement and are really important steps forward. Now we just need to make sure that these well-designed policies are well implemented so it can reach its full potential. At the same time, we need to keep in mind that mandatory reporting doesn't automatically translate into meaningful actions. So we still need different stakeholders come together and hold companies accountable for their human rights commitment.
Yeah. Also important to mention that we will see the first reports in 2025 over the financial year 2024. So we will have a very close look how these reports look like and whether all the requirements and all those what we hope that it could fulfill, whether the reporting really will be there. You mentioned the stakeholders several times. So
Yes.
What stakeholders do you see in the whole world of business and human rights, and how can they maybe better act together?
Sure. The reason I highlighted stakeholders is because even though the corporate world made strong public commitment in sustainability and human rights, their primary focus it's still on profit. So this is we need to keep in mind because this is the nature of business. So in order to actually hold business accountable for their human rights commitment and responsibilities, we do need to mobilize the entire economic system together to actually make sure there's a genuine interest and respect to human rights at the business side. So the stakeholders I'm talking about here include governments. They can actually implement policies which require the business to fulfill their human rights responsibilities. They can develop the policies, either make it financially detrimental for business to violate human rights, or make it economically advantageous for companies to respect them. So those kind of the choices the government can make, but it's important for government to actually play that role. Secondly, I would say that investors has a very important role as well to provide financial support with better terms to those companies that prioritize sustainability and human rights. But at the same time, we also need to keep in mind that a lot of investors are also businesses, and they probably prioritize financial returns over sustainability. So making the sustainable finance an empty promise as well. So we also need to keep in mind the limitations of the investors and hold them accountable as well. And thirdly, I would highlight is the civil society and communities impacted by the company's operations, because they can actually form strong words to hold companies accountable. But to do that, they have to have a very good knowledge for the both short-term and long-term human rights implications for business operations. To know them well, then they can defend their rights better. Last but not the least, I would also highlight the end consumers, because we can tell that internationally there's a strong trend that the end consumers can actually also play an important role by choosing product and solutions or services coming from responsible businesses, and they can actually demand the businesses to fulfill their human rights obligations, as we can see of the global push against blood diamonds. So that's kind of one of the examples I can think of now.
All clear. Liping, thank you so much for your insights, for your thoughts about how to bring forward the whole agenda of business and human rights. I always also want to mention that meanwhile, the European Union also adopted the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in spring 24, which will now be implemented on national level, and we will have a very close eye on whether there is no watering down on the national level. I think it's important. And of course, we will also have a close look and try together with civil society to push the whole process in Geneva when it comes to the binding treaty, to have a global compact on business, global convention, not the compact, the convention on business and human rights. Liping,
That's great.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. We will cooperate on that, I'm sure.
For sure, Petra.
Yes, super. Thank you so much for your time and for your competence sharing with us, and it was a pleasure to have you, and hopefully we will meet again soon in reality.
We will. It's my great pleasure. Thank you, Petra.
Thank you.
Vienna Calling, der Videopodcast von und mit Petra Bayr. Aktuelle Fragen der Zeit, kurz und prägnant